The new Freudian slip is officially dropped, this time from Kamala Harris rather than George Bush. And what we see is that Kamala Harris effectively replaced the word pollution with population. We'll get into how this ended up working with the structure of what she said, as well as the White House trying to run interference on this. So, a Freudian slip is effectively you having an unintentional error in regards to your speech, exposing subconscious feelings that are within your soul. And this is realistically akin to the Google definition, but it's just because it's so standard. Effectively, you intend to say one thing, and in the process, you unintendedly say another. And we saw this with George W. Bush when he was making comments about how unjust the invasion of Ukraine was, and in the process, he said one man's unjust invasion of Iraq. And then he fumbled and realized what he said, and he said Ukraine. And realizing, I think this is George Bush unintentionally admitting the fact that he knows that the invasion of Iraq was wholly unjust. And that's why he had the Freudian slip. I will be playing that clip to show the example in just a moment. Let's go ahead and get into this. From the New York Post, we have Kamala Harris saying the U.S. must reduce population to fight climate change in her latest gaffe. And was it a gaffe, or was it a slip of the tongue? Was it a slip of the tongue unintentionally to be a Freudian slip, or was it simply an accidental misplay of words? I'd argue it was a Freudian slip, but let's go ahead and see what we've got. Here we have from Unbiased Crime Report responding to Kamala Harris from November 27, 2022. He says, "I'm starting to think emissions is a dog whistle for humans." Kamala Harris tweets on November 27, 2022. She says, "Through the Inflation Reduction Act's historic climate investments, we're positioned to cut emissions in half by 2030 and net zero emissions by 2050. How is it that the Inflation Reduction Act, something that's supposed to be used to cut inflation, which means you would have to reduce spending, if you're going to be having historic spending to pay for green energy projects, it's not an Inflation Reduction Act. You're simply using the name of inflation reduction to try and keep this as a soft blow to the people when you're going to completely decimate their energy grid when you try and hyper-electrify it by putting electric cars out by 2030 and making sure you destroy all gas guzzlers. The only thing that's going to happen here is you're going to further impoverish the poor because they will not be able to afford cheaper energy. And then you're going to make a greater and greater disparagement between the classes, and it's going to create even further and further division in society, which very well may be the intended consequences. So here we see a comment that says, "You are the carbon they want to remove." Fascinating idea that you should keep in the back of your mind. So, like he says, emissions is a dog whistle for humans. So, through the Inflation Reduction Act's historic climate investments, we're poised to cut humans in half by 2030 and net zero emissions by 2050. So, net zero for humans by 2050 would be the fact that we would be lowering the population to the effective point where there's an equilibrium on the greenhouse gases that are released and then processed by the environment itself. So, this would be a staggering reduction in population, which goes with what the Georgia Guidestones once said, but they are now gone and they've been destroyed. Go look into that on your own time if you'd like. So, here we have from Vishbara, and this is the example I was talking about in prior, where George W. Bush had his own Freudian slip, where he was speaking about the war in Ukraine and how unjustified the invasion of it was from Vladimir Putin. And in the process, he spoke about how unjustified the invasion of Iraq was, and then used his age as an excuse. Let's go ahead and jump into this. Absolute warmonger.
In contrast, Russian elections are rigged. Political opponents are imprisoned or otherwise eliminated from participating in the electoral process. The result is an absence of checks and balances in Russia and the decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of of Ukraine. Iraq, anyway. 75.
Yeah, what an excuse. Unintentionally admitting to the fact that he understands that his invasion of Iraq was wholly unjust, brutal, and absolutely torrential for the people that lived in the region. Much like how Vladimir Putin is destroying many of the parts of Ukraine that were once built up after the absolute decimation from Hitler in World War II, because during World War II, what happened to the Russians is it's absolutely tragic. And the thing is, if you really want to understand the Russian perspective of why they're so against NATO encroachment and why they're so against the encroachment from so many other people and so many other countries in the United States, is because Russia has been destroyed time and time again through conquest and overthrowing through different regimes. And we saw this in World War II. The thing is, 100 million Russians died in World War II. 100 million people. That is the sacrifice that they put down so that they could stop the Nazis. Every piece of land from the East Coast to Chicago, consider this strip of land. If you've traveled the country, you understand how vast this truly is. Every strip of land from the East Coast to Chicago, the equivalent in Russia, was leveled. Every building destroyed, blown to rubble, torn to bits, every street decimated with craters, every bush burned, every tree turned to ash. And this is what happened to the psyche of the Russian people. And this is why they are so against NATO encroachment, because they are mortified at the possibility that they could experience the same level of decimation that is still stuck in their cognitive psyche from the process that they had experienced in World War II and the stories that they had been told throughout the process of the Cold War. Let's go ahead, get into Kamala Harris talking about how we have to invest in reduced population.
When we invest in clean energy and electric vehicles and reduce population, more of our children can breathe clean air and drink clean water.
And the crowd claps because, I mean, they may have believed that she intended to say pollution, and here we see from Wall Street Silver, just speaking about what I was talking about. Is this a slip, or is it a Freudian slip? It's the quite fascinating angle to take. So we'll go ahead and get into the New York Post article, but the thing that I think needs to be understood in correlation with this is, what is the value of depopulating the planet unless you seek to have totalitarian control and restrictions over a much, much smaller piece of society, because it is so much harder to have this grandiose scale of control on such a wide scale of people. Okay, so here we say Kamala Harris says the U.S. must reduce population to fight climate change in her latest gaffe. Vice President Kamala Harris on Friday called on the U.S. to reduce population in an effort to combat climate change, but she meant to say reduce pollution, according to the White House. The shocking gaffe happened as the 28-year-old vice president delivered remarks at Copen State University in Baltimore, Maryland, on the need to build a clean energy economy. When we invest in clean energy and electric vehicles and reduce population, more of our children can breathe clean air and drink clean water, Harris said, eliciting applause from the audience, which, as we know, and we've seen that the White House has put out a new transcript, and they were showing out what she was intended to say, and it scratches out population, puts pollution, which, this is understandable. This is exactly how you would expect them to handle it, but it all comes down to the fact of, was this an intentional slip? Clearly, this is a major thing to talk about, is the idea of depopulation, which goes into the whole process of the UN 2030 agenda, the World Economic Forum, Davos Group, the Trilateral Commission. The thing that I find so fascinating about this is that this isn't something the establishment wants to talk about at all when it's being pushed by the richest people on the planet and massive organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It's absolutely something that should be talked about. Even if it's conspiratorial nonsense, what you should do is you should use sunlight as the greatest disinfectant so you can completely remove any veil of skepticism that people would share towards these ideas. And speaking of veils of skepticism, we've also got the Biden administration recently talking about the fact that they're talking about working with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to block out the sun to assist in climate change. At what point is this not just the plan that you would read in some ridiculous dystopian novel? What we're going to do is we're going to block out the sun. Who would think of this? Only people that are torrentially terrified of the sun monster or are trying to completely propagandize the populace to be torrentially terrified of the sun monster so that they will tax themselves into poverty. Here we see the slip-up may have been right here on Twitter. It says, "Are you the population she wants to reduce?" Rep. Thomas Massey remarked in a tweet. Wait, what? Josiah Neely, a senior reformer of the Republican Street Institute think tank, said to the vice president's eyebrow-raising remark. Harris, whom a recent poll found to be one of the most unpopular vice presidents in U.S. history, there's no shocker there, has a history of making head-scratching remarks as President Biden's right-hand woman. Earlier this month, she gave a repetitive definition of the word culture at a music festival in New Orleans that drew mockery on social media. Culture is a reflection of our moment in time, right? And in present culture, it is the way that we express how we're feeling about the moment, Harris said, as a part of her Essence Festival of Culture in the CSIS Superdome. That is just like circular logic. It's like, culture is beautiful because it's culture, and culture is great because we experience culture through culture. And anyone that's heard Kamala Harris talks knows this is exactly how she talks. And I don't know if it's the fact that she's effectively playing a character and she's kind of playing to Joe Biden's level of stupidity, because that would be hilarious if she was. But I also wonder if it's the fact that This is just what happens when you're someone who is completely and wholly unqualified for a job. And in the process, the pressure breaks you. Which, I mean, if you're the person who's completely put onto the job and Joe Biden's like, all right, you know what? I'm going to make you our AI czar. Kamala Harris doesn't know anything about AI. She probably barely even knows it means artificial intelligence. There was a clip of her speaking about this. She's like, and it's the most rudimentary explanation of her talking about AI or anyone ever explaining what AI is. It's like you were explaining it to a 5-year-old. And when you listen to it and you think about the fact that this is someone who's supposed to be the czar for artificial intelligence for the United States government, it feels like you're being spoken down to. It also feels like you're being spoken down to by someone that has no fucking clue what they're talking about. That's really all I've got for this one. It's just the media class and the political class once again blundering and playing their hand that I would argue that they've been subversively pushing for a long time. Nonetheless, we can have that conversation in a different video for a different day where I dive into this with a bit more depth. That's all I've got for this. Stay lovely, stay great, tell someone you love them, give this a thumbs up if you liked it, a thumbs down if you didn't. Peace out.